Well, I wanted to talk to you guys this week. I've been thinking a lot about birthdays. There have been several in my family. Last Saturday was my sister-in-law's birthday, and then a few days after that, my nephew Judah turned 3. And then my dog's birthday was on the 9th. He had a real big celebration. And then we also had, my cousin had a birthday. So I did a lot of celebrating this week, mostly from far away. But I really just love birthdays, and if anyone wants to put it on your calendar, my 30th is this summer, July 4th, so easy to remember. Thank you. And I accept gifts in the form of firework displays and any red, white, and blue desserts. But really, isn't it just fun to make people's birthdays special? Does anybody have a birthday today by chance? Did I hear Butch? Does Butch have a birthday today? Charlotte. Oh, Charlotte. Happy belated birthday, Charlotte. Wonderful. Well, birthdays are always just such a fun time, and as many of you know, I have a 1.5-year-old son, and so I had the privilege of throwing him an all-out big birthday bash this past September. And honestly, my husband would tell you I probably went a little overboard. Our theme, I spent a shameful amount of time on Pinterest coming up with this, Donut Grow Up. And I just sort of themed everything around donuts or breakfast in some way. So we had this custom balloon banner. I also made these custom invitations on Etsy. I didn't make them, I'm not that talented. We had a donut cake. There's my little dude. It's actually a cake, but it's in the shape of donuts. And we had, my cousin made some donut macarons. You can see them on the bottom there. We also did like a big breakfast buffet. And so just a variety of things. I still have a freezer full of breakfast food because I just don't know how to make an appropriate amount of food for a crowd. And then there was the semi-indestructible homemade piñata. You gotta know how much tape to use if you're making your own piñata, because this took a very long time to crack open. There's Charlotte and my friend Ethan there working on it. But we eventually had to get all of the adults to take this piñata. That's my dad. He's very athletic, and he still didn't get it cracked open the first try. But so we had a very fun time. My other brilliant idea was to have a maple syrup fountain. You'll see that here. This worked great at the beginning of the party. It flowed nicely, and you just got a little cup, and then you were able to dip like your waffle sticks. But then it sort of turned into this gelatinous sort of mess, which was fine until I tried to turn it off, and then it flung syrup all over my kitchen. I don't recommend you try this at home. This is finding sticky spots for like months later, so fun for a while, but, and you know, just, this was all a lot of fun for me to put together. I just was excited to, I'll show you my little birthday guy there. He lights up our lives, and so it was just fun to sort of bring all of our friends and family together to celebrate him and all that he means to us. And I also just like to do this for other family members as well. It's not quite as elaborate when it's not a kid's birthday, but for Tyler's birthday, we'll I'll do some kind of dessert or cake that he likes, and then we'll have his favorite food. So if you know him, that's usually pizza, pretty easy, or homemade macaroni and cheese. And also, maybe I'll go out of my way to sort of help out with his chores that day so he can have a day off. So walk the dogs or take out the trash, maybe even do a full day of diaper duty. And usually that day, I'm really happy to sort of help out with all of those things. But Tyler, I'll tell you, he's been known to try to milk it a little longer than his birthday. Probably none of you have ever done this before. But you know, later on that week, he'll be like not wanting to take the dogs out, and he'll ask me to do it, and I'm just like, I don't feel like it, I really don't want to. And then I'll make these puppy dog eyes and say, but it's my birthday week. I'm pretty sure he's tried It's My Birthday Month too. But you know, it probably worked on me the first couple of times, but then eventually you're like, nah, you can be king for a day, but not every day. And then I started to think about how that sort of attitude often creeps into my relationship with God. One day I can be all about Him. I can be setting aside my will in favor of His, denying my own desires, and looking for God's desires. This is sort of the equivalent of the all-out, donut, birthday bash, make your favorite food, do all your chores kind of day. But then often, I'm sure you've been there as well, enthusiasm wanes, or I run out of energy or time, or the desire to do things His way. I want to go back to what's easy, what's comfortable, what's convenient for me. And while it might not be sustainable or really necessarily healthy if I were to do my husband's chores every day for the rest of his life, I am called to set God's will above my own each day. That is the call of the follower of Christ. I'm no longer my own, but I serve the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And yet sometimes that feels like really hard work. Have you been there too? Perhaps it comes on a day when you sort of had it up to here with a coworker or a spouse or a roommate, and you're having an argument and you know that you're right, and you don't want to back down for anything. Winning the argument seems like the supreme goal at that moment. Maybe you're just tired. You see somebody in need, but you don't want to take the time right now. Maybe somebody needs help moving, or there's just somebody who's lonely who could use a friend. Or even it's just making time to spend with the Lord. You feel like you just can't give up what little time you have. Maybe there's something that you find yourself struggling with repeatedly. Alcohol, casual sex, overeating, overspending, gambling, pornography. Things that Christ calls you to lay at his feet, but you just can't seem to surrender. Or maybe you're chasing security. The perfect home, the perfect family, a nice nest egg, just trying to pay down your debts. Ultimately trying to create a life that others will see as worthy, but all the while losing sight of the one who's the ultimate source of your security. Maybe you're working really hard in your studies, in your job, maybe your athletic training. You're working so hard that you're wearing yourself thin. And the pursuit of that degree, that next accolade, that next promotion, it just seems to consume your every waking moment. We want to give God our best, but we find ourselves often struggling to give him 5 minutes. We're called to serve others, but it's just a lot of effort we're not sure we want to give right now. We want God to reign in our lives, but we're not sure we want to step off the throne. It's really easy to make Jesus king for a day, but that day in, day out following it demands much more. And so what do we do when we feel that maybe we're not up to the task? We're certainly not the first people in history to wrestle with what it means to follow Jesus. And so today I'd like to turn to Matthew chapter 21. And we're going to take a look at Jesus at a climactic point in his ministry. As you know, we're celebrating Palm Sunday today. And this marks Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and ultimately the final days leading up to his crucifixion and resurrection. So now read with me, starting at verse 1, Matthew chapter 21. I'm reading from the New International Version. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there, with her colt by her. And tie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. "Say to daughter Zion, see your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt, and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest heaven!" When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." For many of us, this is a familiar story. It's a turning point in Jesus' ministry where he's preparing for what is to come. To this point, he's been teaching, preaching, and healing throughout the whole region, and now he has completed his journey to Jerusalem. This account of his arrival, though, it's sort of interesting because it paints a scene full of irony. Let's consider first the timing. So Jesus and his disciples, they're arriving in Jerusalem because it's time for Passover. And Passover, as you may know, is one of the oldest Jewish festivals, and it commemorates Israel's deliverance from slavery in Egypt. But that description really doesn't quite capture the significance of this festival and how it's sort of wrapped up in the very identity of the nation of Israel. So I want to show you a quote here from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, and they put it this way. "The Exodus was the redemptive event par excellence in the life of God's covenant people. The Passover reenacted annually the greatest miracle Yahweh performed out of grace for his chosen. It was to become the focal point of Jewish history. The Passover celebration retold the story of freedom after more than 400 years of Egyptian bondage. The frequent Old Testament allusions to that deliverance indicate that it was a source of hope for the nation's future redemption. So we have here tons of pilgrims from near and far. They're coming to the city of Jerusalem to celebrate Passover together. Now, historians estimate that perhaps 200,000 additional people or so descended upon the city, and it meant that they were seeking accommodations for sleeping and for feasting in sort of every available space. You can imagine it was such a bustle of activity and excitement all throughout the city. And not only that, but let's think of what the people's attitudes were. Messianic hope would have sort of been kindled more strongly now than at any other season, because during Passover they were remembering God's redemption. It was at the forefront of their minds. He redeemed them from the tyranny of Egypt, and he could undoubtedly do it again with the tyranny of Rome, their present-day oppressors. Now let's talk about Rome for a minute. Rome was the superpower of the day. Their economic and military dominance over the region, it left the majority of people in poverty. Heavy tax burdens were levied against the Jewish people and others that kept the elites and the citizens of Rome well fed, but others suffered increasing impoverishment, hunger, and debt. Now, Rome would appoint sort of puppet kings or governors throughout their conquered territories, basically to keep the peace and quell any rebellions that were to arise, in order that they could keep their power. Not only this, but the emperors, beginning with Augustus, or the adopted son of Julius Caesar, set themselves up as gods deserving of worship. These were the realities of living within the Roman Empire. Life was hard for first-century Jews, and they longed to be free of Roman imperial rule. And how interesting that during Passover, the great national Exodus festival, Jesus decides to make his move. So, what then were these jubilant crowds on Palm Sunday? What would they be expecting of Jesus? Sort of against that backdrop of Rome's military might, it's likely they too were expecting a warrior king. Living under the subjugation of the empire, they might be looking for the violent overthrow of their oppressors. Their national aspirations were such that they expected God to act on behalf of his covenant people once again, and the only way they could see that happening was a full reversal of power and a defeat of their enemies. But as we know, that's not quite what they got in Jesus. He was certainly king, yet not maybe the kind of king they expected. In fact, according to the Fortress Commentary in the Bible, his entry into Jerusalem in some way parodies imperial entry processions. You know, the kind that celebrated conquering generals or the arrival of governors or emperors in a city just to proclaim the grandeur of the empire and to sort of impress upon them to remind them of their power over the subjugated peoples. These kinds of processions, they defined greatness in terms of military violence, defeat of enemies, power, plunder, and public gratitude. But here comes Jesus. He's riding in not on a war horse, but on a donkey. And as Matthew points out, this is a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy from Zechariah 9:9. In verse 5, Matthew records, "Say to daughter Zion, see your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey." Daughter Zion refers to the inhabitants of the city of Jerusalem. And in this prophecy, we see that the arrival of the Messianic king was that he would arrive in meekness. New Testament scholar Donald Hagner writes, "Riding not the white stallion of a conqueror, but in servant fashion, riding the lowly and ordinary beast of burden, and thus bringing peace rather than war." And yet we see the crowd. They're welcoming him and carpeting his path with clothes and branches of trees. Despite the humble mount, the crowds bring him into the city with a public demonstration that would be befitting a king. Their shouts and their proclamations, they reveal their hopes, and that is that this Jesus is the long-awaited one, the son of David. His ancestry aligns with that of the Messiah, coming in the name of the Lord. And they're proclaiming that he is Messiah, but yet not fully understanding what that means. And thus we find here the greatest irony. The one who was welcomed with such jubilation, with hope and extreme anticipation, he's going to soon receive the ire of the crowds and abandonment by many who followed him. King for a day. Now let's fast forward to Friday. Jesus has been betrayed and arrested. The disciples have fled. He has been condemned by the high priestly leadership, and he now stands before the governor Pilate, who's offering to release a prisoner to the crowds, either Barabbas or Jesus. Matthew 27 records, But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and have Jesus executed. "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. "What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" Pilate asked. They all answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." The starkness of the change in attitude towards Jesus is rather striking. Now, there's some disagreement among scholars whether this crowd here, demanding Barabbas, is the same one that welcomed him into the city only days earlier. But one thing is clear: there has been a significant shift in public opinion. Even if it's a different crowd, where are those people now who were filled with expectation? Is it possible that their expectations were not met, and so they were quick to abandon their earlier hope that Jesus was the Messiah? Another quote for you here, found in the IVP Bible Background Commentary on the New Testament. Craig Keener writes that these events occur early in the morning, and much of the crowd may not be those whom Jesus had been teaching after arriving from Bethany each day. But ancient literature also reports how quickly the masses often changed allegiances. The chief priests were well respected and more visible than Jesus, especially to foreign Jews visiting Jerusalem for the feast and unfamiliar with local politics. Barabbas would also appeal to those drawn to more militant responses to Roman oppression than Jesus provided. So if at once Jesus was thought to be the Messiah, the one who would conquer the oppressive Roman regime, it now appears that quite the opposite is happening. Jesus stands seemingly helpless, in their custody, being offered up as a common criminal. How could he be the promised Messiah? Have you ever had your expectations come sort of crashing down when facing a new reality? This happened to me within the past year and a half when I became a parent, and I'm pretty sure many other new parents have experienced this. And I have a video of what I want to show you. It sort of gives some examples of how expectations change when you have kids.
We've done lots of research and basically have parenting all figured out.
Why does everybody say it's going to be so complicated? It's just a baby.
I'm going to make all of her own baby food. From organic things. It's better for the baby that way. Our baby will never use electronics.
iPads, iPhones. You know our baby's going to be awesome at sports, just like we were.
Potty training?
6 months max.
No accidents. I am definitely not going to let myself go when I become a mom.
We're going to make our baby look like ours.
Not the other way around. It's nap time.
Gotta go. All I can say is, our baby will be throwing fits in public.
We're going to have control of our kid, unlike those moms. I'm not just kidding that anymore. Our baby is going to sleep through the whole night.
Yeah, in her own crib.
The last picture there, that's what my house looks like most days. You definitely think about things a little differently pre and post baby. And for example, Jack, my toddler, he pretty much subsists on a diet of whole milk, string cheese, and ketchup. Not every meal is very well balanced. And honestly, he didn't sleep through the night until after he was 1. That was rough. And now he pretty much demands to watch Cookie Monster and Elmo, Cook and Mo, on demand at any time of day, especially during diaper changes. And you know, while my expectations of parenting, they haven't always lined up with the reality I'm experiencing, I'm learning to accept that and to find beauty in what is, even amongst the chaos. But it's not always so easy. When you've pinned your hopes on one thing, and things seem to be going in an entirely different direction. When the Jesus you wanted isn't the Jesus you get. When the conquering Messiah you hope for appears weak and helpless. Do you switch sides? Do you give up your kingdom allegiance? Do you run away, deny him 3 times, or yell with the crowd, crucify him? We know how this story ends. Jesus' way was not the way we expected, but it's exactly what we needed. We didn't need a warmongering king. We needed subversive peace. We didn't need to slaughter our enemies, but to love them. We didn't need violence, but we needed Jesus. And when the king we want is not the king we get, we need to take a step back and see who is really sitting on the throne of our hearts. We are not so different from the first century nation of Israel in that we have our own pressures and propaganda from the empire. And we also have our own aspirations and expectations. Unfortunately, the world is trying to sell us a bill of goods, namely that our own happiness and success is the ultimate pursuit and goal in life. And thus we deserve to have whatever we want, and we should chase it by any means necessary. If we ignore the plight of immigrants and asylum seekers and separate them from their families, so be it, if it means we get to preserve our comfortable way of life. If it means you have to trample other people to get to the top of the employment ladder, so be it. There was only one spot anyways. If it means you have to leave your spouse because they're not meeting your needs, so be it. If it means you can't look a homeless person in the eye, so be it, because you don't owe them anything and you've worked hard to get where you are. If it means you have to give all your time to making your own life better, so be it, because isn't that what life is all about? That's what our empire would have us believe. And when I say empire, I don't just mean our current presidential administration or the government, but also larger cultural pressures and attitudes. Certainly, some forms of empire propaganda are more insidious than others. And New Testament scholar N.T. Wright even cautions about our own aspirations and expectations as well. He writes, we want to graduate, get a job, earn some money, perhaps get married. But somehow we have to navigate the choppy and increasingly stormy waters where all those normal and natural things meet the sharp, often heartless wind of contemporary culture. How do we prevent our own aspirations from being merely self-centered and ultimately idolatrous? And I would ask, how do we guard against making Jesus king only for a day? When it's convenient, when it doesn't challenge us too much, and it aligns with our expectations. Instead of king for a day, how do we make him king every day? When he demands more than we're willing to give, when he would have us handle things differently than the way we want to, when we're faced with the choice of taking up our cross, king for a day, or king every day. There's certainly no simple answer here. It's a daily dying to self, and that is far from simple. When you're in that argument with your spouse or your coworker or your roommate, it looks like taking a step back and seeing the relationship as more important than your pride. It's a willingness to turn the other cheek, to forgive, to make space for others, and to give up your right to be right. When you find yourself wrapped up in your own little world, the dying to self, it looks like taking up your cross by reaching outside yourself and serving your neighbor. It's focusing your eyes on Jesus instead of on your own daily worries. When you're caught up in some repetitive sin or cycle of unhealthy behavior, it's confessing, surrendering, and seeking help and accountability. It's giving up your own right to control your life. When you're pursuing your own vision of success or building for yourself your own version of earthly security, dying to self means reevaluating priorities and realigning your identity with who Christ has called you to be. None of this is simple, but it is possible if we put our trust in God. Not just when it feels convenient, though, or comfortable. Not just for a day, but every day. Imagine what would take place in our homes, our church, our city, if we were to be more diligent about keeping our kingdom allegiance. If we had more days that resembled those all-out birthday bashes rather than apathy and self-centeredness. Our families, they might see a little more patience from us as we remember how patient Christ has been with us. Our friends might notice that we pay attention to their needs and seek to care for them. Our neighbors might see us going out of our way to show some courtesy or kindness. Our coworkers might notice our positive attitude and encouragement. Strangers might benefit from our generosity and gifts of time and service. Our church might continue to grow because of the way Christ is shaping our hearts and transforming our minds to be more and more like him. So let us choose this day to serve him, and the next day to serve him, and the next day after that. May he be our King every day. Would you all pray with me? Dear Jesus, we are a needy people, and we too often sort of usurp your rightful place in our hearts and wish to live according to our own selfish desires. But God, we need you to continue to teach us to pray for your kingdom to come and your will to be done. Help us, Lord, to take our cross and follow you each and every day. In Jesus' name.